Former human rights commissioner suing or planning or launching a lawsuit, sorry, on a Conservative MP here in Canada. Firstly,
Canada's
I would like to play this video is from, I believe, either last year or the year before when this news first came out. They don't really talk about his posts per se. They just say that the things in them are, perceived as um as anti-Semitic, and one of their reasonings is because the former human rights commissioner, sorry, um compares what's happening in Gaza to the Holocaust, which, if you were just watching the little update on what was happening in Gaza due to Israel, you would know that reporters all around the world are, including in Gaza, are comparing it to the Holocaust because it's an apartheid, is terrible. And we'll watch a recap on what happened a few years ago before when this first came out, and then from there we're going to watch his press conference where he's talking about how, he's planning on suing this MP, why he's planning on suing this MP, and then depending on how long it takes, I did also grab a podcast that he's featured in talking about this. And again, depending on how long it takes, we will watch the full thing. If not, we'll skip halfway through and come back to it on a later date. Ooh, hiccup.
newest human rights commissioner has resigned before he assumed his duties. The exit follows weeks of controversy about his appointment. The CBC's Janice McGregor joining me now live from Ottawa. Janice, out of the job before day one, what happened?
Yeah, very sort of interesting saga as it has kind of played out over the last few weeks. Of course, the Canadian Human Rights Commission is the body that does research, upholds human rights in Canada, but most essentially is in charge of litigating complaints, mediating complaints about discrimination in this country. And as such, very important for the commissioner heading up that body to be seen as fair and beyond reproach and without any personal conflicts or views that might become problematic if they were asked to oversee a dispute over which they had been found to, in the past, have made statements indicating a bias one way or the other. At issue here is a series of tweets that Burju Ditani made when he was a graduate student in England and was posting under a different name, the name Mujahid Ditani. These posts were concerning to Jewish groups in particular who brought the complaint about this because they believed they were anti-Semitic. There are references in some of the things that he was posting on social media, comparisons to Israel as being an apartheid state.
Which it is, by the way. What they're doing in Gaza is, in my opinion, far worse in comparison now, but is an apartheid in the same way that what happened in South Africa was an apartheid.
Making comparisons of the current situation of Palestinians in Israel, Holocaust comparisons, and also some time when he was at the London School of Economics lecturing as part of, quote, Israel Apartheid Week. Also,
see, this is exactly what he is, going to be suing against for defamation, because these are all things that, like, we're still saying today about what is going on in Gaza, about how Israel is, committing genocide on these people. And because of that, his stance on that, people like MPs in my country were smearing him. Were saying that he's anti-Semitic. We're saying that he's, this horrible, horrible human being when he isn't. He's just somebody who is pro-Palestinian. And on top of that, not only was he, being accused of this by an MP, but also, like you heard, in the clip from a couple years ago, or a year ago, sorry. They also said that a Jewish rights group um, also made those allegations, which is part of the reason why he resigned.
In his application to be the Human Rights Commissioner, Mr. Ditani did not disclose his past activities as a graduate student in London, nor did he disclose that he has at various points in different contexts used different names. Now, there was a law firm asked by the Minister of Justice, Arif Rani, to review the facts of this case. And Mr. Ditani had a chance to get a lawyer, make submissions of his own. He did not feel that what he was being accused of was legitimate or fair, argued he wasn't anti-Semitic. And indeed, it's a 48-page report that the Justice Minister's office has made public this afternoon. And they find that they can't say that he harbored or harbors any beliefs that would be characterized as anti-Semitic, or that he has demonstrated any biases, conscious or unconscious, towards Jews or Israelis. According to this report, was careful to constrain his criticism of Israel to the state of Israel and not to extend that to the Israeli people or the Jewish people. That said, though, in the report, it does say that he intentionally omitted the reference to having a different name or a pseudonym.
Now, that's something that, again, to me is just so, just one, telling, and two, just annoying, because here in Canada, a lot of our politicians, like that are in other places around the world, consider themselves, and I'm saying it like this for TOS reasons on Twitch, but consider themselves Schmionists. And because they consider themselves Schmionists, um, they're more pro-Israel, right? So I'm just gonna look up here. I should have this pulled up beforehand. Okay, so this is a clip of Chrystia Freeland, the former finance minister and former deputy prime minister um, to Justin Trudeau, or former prime minister. And we click here. This is the French debates for the Liberal leadership race, which is how Mark Carney became our current prime minister. And we're going to watch this. I don't know if this is going to actually play it because I didn't rewatch this, obviously. But she snaps back real fast at him when he says Hamas instead of Palestinians.
D'accord avec Hamas, nous sommes d'accord avec une two
Nous ne sommes pas d'accord avec Hamas. Mais concernant Hamas, oui.
Contre Hamas. Et pour une solution à deux États.
We heard you correct Mr. Carney's French a number of times during the debate. You seemed either to help him or perhaps to show Liberal members that you think you speak French better than he does. What were you trying to do with that? I just remember the question on Hamas. I know Mark well, and I know his positions.
So Chrystia Freeland, which is basically why I'm showing this clip, is what I'm getting to. She is a very, very, very avid Schmionist when it comes to the the Israel-Palestine war. And not only that, but this is Justin Trudeau saying how he feels about Schmionism.
No one in Canada should ever be afraid to call themselves a Zionist. I am a Zionist.
So that pretty much just, gives you an example of just like where Canadian politicians, especially Canadian politicians in the Liberal Party and obviously the Conservative Party too, Per Polyev has said many, 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 many times that he wants to deport people for participating in what he calls woke anti-Semitism, which is basically just people being pro Palestine. I'm just going to pull that clip up too. He also said that at the Holocaust memorial ceremony last year, which I found to be very disgusting as somebody who is obsessed with history, because he said that he wants to deport people, and one of the first acts that the Nazi party did in the Holocaust was mass deportations. So I found that to be absolutely incomprehensible, and I don't understand why other people do not, or at least why the mainstream media didn't. So, sorry, I'm missing no typo.
Shalom.
Okay, I have it pulled up. I believe it's about 4 minutes in. Let me see.
New threats emanating from Iran into October 7th. It was front on October.
Here. And then we get to see Per Polyev's Shmayanism on display.
October 7th. An unprovoked attack that was deliberately designed to carry out the maximum amount of cruelty against the most innocent people. A seven-front war initiated by Tehran seeks to carry out a Holocaust-like attack on the Jewish people. October 7th was the biggest.
So he's allowed to compare what's happening on what happened on October 7th to the Holocaust, but the former new Human Rights Commissioner isn't allowed to do the same when it comes to an act of apartheid and genocide in Gaza by the hands of the Israeli government. Okay. Sure.
Massacre of Jews.
I mean, I just got the idea that they didn't want anybody comparing the two, but I guess when you're a Shmayanist, there's different rules.
It's the Holocaust, but in the period that followed,
and at
Israel
again
has
the
fought
Holocaust
back.
memorial
the
ceremony
regimes,
as
the
well.
terrorist groups that sought to annihilate Israel have themselves been annihilated, and Israel has friends, as do the Jewish people. Friends that will stand through thick and thin, through fire and water, not equivocating, not speaking out of both sides of our mouth. We must stand with the Jewish people and the state of Israel in their effort to preserve their existence and to live a peaceful, democratic life. And that should not be taken for granted. We see on our own streets anti-Semitism, guided by obscene, woke ideologies that have led to an explosion in hate crimes. Hate crimes.
Isn't that crazy that he's conflating the pro-Palestinian protests to actual real life acts of anti-Semitism that have happened in Canada? He will mention the college school demonstrations in Canada as well, but conflating people peacefully protesting against an apartheid state and being, they're in support of people who are currently being genocided, well, actual neo-Nazis are out there legitimately committing hate crimes on Jewish people is, in my opinion, absolutely fucking horrid. And I can't believe nobody in the mainstream media ever called him out for this. Nobody said that, what what he did was, incomprehensible, that he should be reprimanded for it, or anything like that. He was doing this at the Holocaust Memorial Ceremony, saying shit like that at the Holocaust Memorial Ceremony. Absolutely insane. And it's getting worse. I'm, pausing in between, but it's gonna get worse.
We're up over 100% in Canada before October 7th. Now they're up 251%, with Jews being the principal victims of those crimes. We must not just condemn these things, we must take action against them. We must deport from our country any temporary resident that is here on a permit or a visa that is carrying out violence or hate crimes on our soil. It was obscene that the IRGC remained legal in Canada for 4 years.
Yeah, so, sorry, I did my outro screen. Yeah, so that is Per Poilievre's opinions on the pro-Palestinian protests and people who are temporary immigrants, aka international students or temporary foreign workers, or anybody here on asylum claims, that he wants to deport them for participating in protests, which absolutely fucking horrid. So I wanted to do those as like a backdrop so you can see just like what the mainstream politicians, the leaders of the Liberal Party, the former prime minister of our country, and what Per Poilievre thought on Shmayanism and the hypocrisy of the Conservative Party, who, are totally fine with their leader saying things about the about what happened on October 7th and comparing it to the Holocaust, but when somebody else does it, especially a person of color doing it, who is, going to be the new, or was at the time going to be the new human rights commissioner, does it, it's, oh, we can't have that. We can't have anybody be pro-Palestinian.
That the explanation he gave about not being fulsome about the different names he's used was not credible, that he didn't include periods of employment and unemployment until he was specifically asked to do so in terms of his employment history. And there were parts of the application process where he was specifically asked if he had a conflict of interest or if he had done anything that could bring the government of Canada into disrepute. And he had answered no and no to that. And obviously, now we have had this controversy. So,
and in regards to what he has said about, like, what's going on in Gaza and in Palestine by the hands of the Israeli government, I don't see that as a conflict of interest. Like, you can be against the government of a country and not be pro, or not be against the people of that country, or not be against the ethnic, religion, majority, sorry, in the country as well, because Jewish people are the majority in Israel. So now we're going to be moving on to the actual announcement. It's about 20 minutes long. I think I'm going to skip the question period and just cover him talking and bits of his lawyer talking. And then when it comes to the questions, I'm just going to skip them.
Good morning, everyone. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm addressing you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We honor the people and the land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I'm joined here today by Yavar Hamid, Ottawa-based human rights lawyer, Sam Hirsch, with Independent Jewish Voices, and my lawyer, Alexi Wood, partner at St. Lawrence Barristers, PC. My name is Birgit Itani. I am a human rights professional with a long history of fighting for justice for the most marginalized. From 2020 to 2023, I was the director of the Yukon Human Rights Commission, and before that, I spent 3 years as the assistant regional director of the Alberta Human Rights Commission. Towards the end of May 2022, a senior official with Justice Canada sought me out and invited me to apply for the role of Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. In June 2024, after a lengthy
So like we heard, he already had a few years worth of experience as a human rights commissioner in the Yukon under his belt before he became the new, now former human rights commissioner for Canada.
And rigorous application and vetting process spanning nearly 2 years and glowing recommendations from my previous employers, I was appointed Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission by the Governor General on the recommendation of the Justice Minister. I was set to begin my role on August 8th, 2024, and would become the first person of color and the first Muslim to hold this prestigious position. I felt honored, humbled, and excited for the opportunity and the prospect of bringing real and meaningful changes to the Commission at a critical moment, while also advocating for Canadians, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds who face discrimination. On August 12, 2024, 4 days after my role was set to begin, I announced my resignation as Chief Commissioner. Shortly after my appointment was announced in June, I became the subject of a vicious smear campaign, painting me as a terrorist supporter and an anti-Semite. These comments led to a third-party investigation. Ultimately, the investigators released a report that found the allegations of anti-Semitism, bias against Jewish people or Israelis, and terrorism support and/or sympathy to be unfounded. That report is publicly available. Despite the report's unequivocal conclusion on these points, the vicious public attacks by a number of groups and individuals persisted in the following days and weeks. That's why I'm here today to announce that I've launched defamation lawsuits against those who spearheaded a targeted attack against me this past summer. Conservative Member of Parliament Melissa Lantsman, right-wing media personality Ezra Levant, and the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA. If I may direct your attention to the monitor, on the same day the report came out, the Deputy Leader of the Conservatives, Member of Parliament Melissa Lantsman, reacted by posting, "Anti-Semites should hold no position in Canada's government." This tweet was viewed over 44,000 times. It was retweeted more than 700 times and liked more than 2,500 times. It was also quoted in an article by the CBC. In October, 2 months.
The CBC even quoted the tweet by a Conservative MP smearing this man for being anti-Semitic, supposedly, allegedly, which he says he wasn't.
Months after the report was published, Ezra Levant called me a, quote, Islamic extremist who praised terrorism as a tactic against Jews, end quote. This tweet was viewed almost 46,000 times.
And at the same time, because he himself, like he said, is a Muslim man, they're being Islamophobic to him. They're crying that he is being anti-Semitic while being Islamophobic to him. And nobody seems to care, or at least nobody seemed to care at the time.
And liked 1,300 times. These aren't even the worst things that have been said about me over the last 8 months. The statements of claim are now public. They list many more examples of the defamatory statements that were shared far and wide. I cannot sufficiently underscore the impact that this vicious campaign has had on me over the past few months. It has caused serious and potentially irreparable damage to my reputation. It has impacted my mental and physical health. It has also affected my family and loved ones. I'm taking this step today to reclaim my reputation and to seek accountability for the damage that has been done to me.
I'm honestly a little surprised that this is the first time we're seeing somebody actually retaliate to the to being alleged as being anti-Semitic, because here in Ontario, a former, now independent, former NDP MP, or sorry, MPP, because it's in the province of Ontario, Sarah Jama, was removed from the Ontario NDP caucus for Israeli Hamas comments, as the CTV would say. She also refused to take off a keffiyeh in the Ontario Parliament building. I can't remember what it's called. In Baysh, no, Queen Street. Sorry, Queens Park. And fuck, I mean, I know people who used to fucking work there. I should know the name of it. And because she was wearing a keffiyeh and was pro-Palestinian, she was made to remove, and now is running in Hamilton as an independent. So I'm going to bring this one up first. It's only a couple minutes.
Fresh tensions at Queen's Park tonight over the ban of a traditional Arab scarf. Hamilton Centre independent MPP Sarah Jama refused to remove her keffiyeh and then ignored an order from the Speaker of the House to leave the legislature. Jason Gaidola joins us live in studio tonight with the latest. Good evening, Jason.
Yeah, good evening, Matt. A major standoff today, one that appears will happen again and again after Jama told reporters that she will continue to don the keffiyeh moving forward.
The expectation in the chamber is that political statements should be made during debate rather than through the use of props or symbols. I'm going to ask the member for Hamilton Centre to come to order.
The keffiyeh ban inside Ontario's legislature intensified today after one of Hamilton's MPPs ignored the Speaker's order again.
Sarah Jama, you are named. You must leave the chamber. The member is currently not eligible to be recognized in the House.
Draped in the traditional checkered Arab scarf, Hamilton Centre's Sarah Jama was issued a dismissal from the legislative chamber after refusing to remove the garment and then defying an
and Big Tough Guy is going to come over, watch.
Order to leave. This following the Speaker's call to restrict the garment, believing it to be a political statement tied to the Israel-Hamas war, and a vote to uphold the ban this past Tuesday.
It's not that I think the rules don't apply to me. I think the rules don't apply to many people who have worn clothing around supporting Ukraine, or like I said, a member this morning, a colleague, who was wearing a tartan very intentionally, referring to the fact that he was wearing it politically, and nothing occurred. So I think the rules are arbitrarily applied. Absolutely.
Not only is, the rules arbitrarily applied, but people will also wear things like the little leather patch or other pins and stuff like that as forms of protest or signs of solidarity as well in the provincial house and in the federal house as well. And that's something that, like, again, super absurd that they made her, they made her leave the NDP in Ontario, removed her from the caucus for this, and it's just horrid. And again, it's another example of the one-sidedness of the treatment towards people who are pro-Palestinian in Canada in comparison to people who are pro-genocide.
Absolutely, I'll be back. I don't know about this afternoon, but I'll definitely continue as I'm here to continue to wear it.
Jama's rejection then sparked outrage from other local MPPs.
The member for Hamilton Mountain, come to order. The member for Niagara West, come to order.
And escalation from the Tories and New Democrats.
Never seen a government more willing to
divide. Martin Stiles is the leader of the Ontario NDP, and under her leadership, she was part of the people who removed Sarah Jama from her place in the caucus.
Than this government here today.
Order.
And we've seen it for months.
What the Leader of the Opposition is doing is dividing people by suggesting that the government of Ontario has a ban, Mr. Speaker. That is not the case.
After today's sitting, questions loom on how the Speaker will respond if the ban continues to be ignored.
Again, I mean, that's kind of a question for the Speaker about how he's going to proceed, but it's the government that has continued to uphold this ban, and I still maintain they need to do the right thing here.
Premier Doug Ford wasn't in the chamber today.
She says that, and then, as I will show here, Sarah Jama ended up being removed from her caucus spot.
MPPs voted today to censure NDP Sarah Jama over controversial comments about the Israel-Hamas war.
And while Jama's party voted against her censure, she has been removed from caucus. CTV's Mike Walker has been following the proceedings and joins us now with these latest developments. Mike.
Well, Michelle, Nathan, this means that Sarah Jama will not be recognized inside the legislature, essentially prevented from speaking and taking part in debates unless she issues an apology and retracts her social media posts about the Israel-Hamas war. Now, in that social media post earlier this month, Jama spoke out against Israeli occupation of Palestine land without mentioning the Hamas attack launched against Israeli civilians, which has been described as anti-Semitic.
Again, the difference in how people who are pro-Israeli, pro-genocide, and how people who are pro-Palestinian are treated in Canada is staggeringly different.
Jama has apologized and condemned Hamas, but the post remains pinned to the top of her feed. Now, during the debate this morning, Sarah Jama addressed the legislature for the first time since coming under fire for her social media post, and she was critical of the government's censure motion and stood by her statement.
The Ford government has done nothing meaningful to say about these atrocities and has now targeted me to distract from its own scandals. And those of us committed to Palestinian life refuse to be distracted. I restate my call for an immediate ceasefire by Israeli forces and for the immediate restoration of food, water, fuel, and electricity in Gaza. And I applaud the many elected officials in Canada who have joined this call in recent days.
Your voice has weight, and what you say can cause harm and can destabilize countries. Madam Speaker, inflammatory remarks, insensitive sentiments, and attending marches of hate do nothing to advance the cause of peace.
Marches of hate, aka pro-Palestinian marches.
Peace.
If you cannot have the moral clarity to understand that the root cause of this is terrorism that's funded by the terror.
The PC MPP part is that she is a progressive conservative MPP, member of provincial parliament.
It's an illegitimate Islamic regime in Iran. If you are out there spreading a message of divisiveness instead of caring for people, then you should not be in this legislature.
Now, the NDP did.
Again, treating her and other pro-Palestinian people in our government and in different roles in our government completely differently. And signaling
and those
them out.
closest to me. Je ne saurais trop insister sur l'impact que cette campagne vicieuse a eu sur moi au cours des derniers mois. Cela a causé des dommages graves et potentiellement irréparables à ma réputation. Ça a eu un impact sur mon santé mentale et physique. Ça a aussi anti-Palestinian or anti-Arab. Too often, these baseless allegations are accompanied by bigoted, Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian or anti-Arab tropes, such as being terrorist sympathizers, harboring religiously extremist views, and holding quote-unquote un-Canadian values. It is dangerous to assert that academic research, being critical of a government, attending protests, and simply having a Muslim name are reasons for suspicion. That is un-Canadian. Normalizing these stereotypes not only harms reputations, It can also have negative impacts on the psychological and physical safety of their targets and the wider community to which they belong. We have witnessed the deadly impacts of Islamophobia here in Canada time and again. With the Afzal family murders in London, Ontario in 2021, the fatal Quebec mosque shooting of January 29th, 2017, and numerous incidents of Muslims being verbally abused, spat on, and women having their hijabs ripped off. Shameful.
And most recently, a woman in Ajax, Ontario, having her hijab set on fire, or attempted to be set on fire by some crazed potential Parapaliev supporting person in the library, in a library, trying to set this woman with a hijab on fire.
Fully, Canada remains one of the deadliest countries for Islamophobic hate crimes in the G7. I stand here today on behalf of the countless others who have been targeted but who lack the resources to seek justice. It is expensive to litigate, and I'm crowdsourcing funds to help pay for this legal process. I want to take this opportunity to thank the many people who have supported me during these difficult times.
And these types of litigations aren't something that like is done frivolously in Canada like they are in America. Like we don't have a whole lot of people who are just like throwing lawsuits for no reason on people. Like it's not a common thing to happen here. So the fact that he's actually taking this to the courts and trying to fight this and trying to fight the Conservative MP, the independent journalist, the right-wing guy, and one other person or entity, I can't remember, is very rare. It's a very rare occurrence here in Canada.
Times. They represent a large swathe of the Canadian population and are from many backgrounds and faith traditions. I particularly wish to thank the members of the Jewish and Israeli communities who have supported and defended me these past few months. To be clear, anti-Semitism is real, full stop. It is dangerous, insidious, and pervasive, and has increased significantly in Canada since October 7th, 2023.
That is true, and not only that, but Canada has a very dark history of anti-Semitism too. In Toronto, in I believe the 1920s, 1930s, during World War II, there was a huge riot in Toronto. That was a huge neo-Nazi riot against Jewish people, and it was horrible. People did everything they could to defend themselves from the attackers, and it's something that like we learn on PSAs on our TVs here in Canada about. Like, it is just horrible.
As a human rights advocate, I will continue to fight against anti-Semitism. I will also continue to fight against Islamophobia and
like he said with the attacks, anti-Semitism does still live today in Canada. And the fact that people are trying to conflate pro-Palestinian protests, pro-Palestinian marches, pro-Palestinian demonstrations to the real life anti-Semitism that is here in Canada is absolutely just horrid and disgusting in my opinion. I do not condone it. I do not I don't think it's fair to conflate the two, and I honestly think that it does more people a disservice and puts more Jewish people at risk than actually like dealing with the real anti-Semitism that is out there. Like conflating things that aren't anti-Semitic to anti-Semitism is just going to feel more anti-Semitism.
Anti-Palestinian racism, which have also increased. And I will continue to fight against all forms of hate and bigotry. That is my job. I'm here today to send a message. Those who use their platforms and positions to spew hate and misinformation must face accountability for their actions, which have real consequences. These dangerous actions cannot go without recourse. Every one of us has an inherent right to live free from discrimination. We also have a right to defend ourselves when faced with allegations like the ones that are the subject of this litigation. Thank you. I'd now like to invite my lawyer, Alexi Wood, to the podium.
And Canada, as you know, Perepalev and Jordan Peterson and many others have complained, is a country that does already have very, very strict human rights laws and bills. And the fact that people are weaponizing that and using Canada's, reputation of trying to, combat that kind of stuff, because we do have freedom of expression here, but freedom of expression and free speech does have some limitations, of course. But trying to use that against people who are, trying to advocate for people who are being currently genocided is beyond me. Now, I think I am going to skip what the lawyer says. She's a human rights lawyer. He has another couple of human rights advocates, including a Jewish human rights advocate on his side too. But I do want to move on to the podcast that he is featured in, and I'm mostly doing that because the podcast part is over an hour, or just under an hour long.
Yeah, you're all just out of sorts because they're stuck in them. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Amira. Good to be with you.
Let's start with what brought you to human rights work in the first place. What is it that made you want to go into this field?
So, the single biggest factor is that I'm a son of a refugee from Uganda. So, growing up...
By the way, before we get too far into this, along the lines of, people not being able to have political statement pieces inside either the provincial house or the federal house, people wear Israeli dog tags all of the time in both. Nobody says fucking anything. Just, again, trying to point out the hypocrisy of it.
My father told us about his experiences during the Idi Amin regime, and him fleeing from Uganda, or being expelled from Uganda, I should say. And so he would tell stories about growing up on a street called Nakasero Street, where the most notorious prison in the city of Kampala was housed. And he could hear the screams at night from his bedroom, seeing people huddled and secreted away into military vehicles, never to be heard from again, or soldiers going up to dormitories looking for certain last names that were associated with certain ethnicities, and their forced disappearances, the murders, the bodies that were so voluminous that they would clog up the rivers in Kampala. And my father to this day still suffers from night terrors as a result of his experiences for as long as I've known him. And that was an indelible experience that's burned into my brain and always has been. The idea of a refugee never feeling settled, the idea that no matter how well you do in society, that the political forces can change and everything can be taken from you. So this idea of being on the run, which was really powerful in my psyche, that's where it starts. I think that journey then continues in grad school. So when I was a master's student, having explored, and my master's thesis focused on Palestine. But that education, having a background in international human rights law, meant that you imbibed a lot in human rights atrocities across the globe. But looking at that critically was always to consider.
He even wrote his master's on the genocide in Palestine. like it's not like he's being like frivolous with what he's talking about when he's talking about this stuff. He knows what he's talking about when he talks about this stuff. And the fact that he was treated like a pariah and now is having to, you know, try to clear his name and fight back is just sad. It's just beyond sad. Like it's almost as bad here in Canada when it comes to Schmyanus. Again, doing that for TOS. If Schmyanus, you know, bullying and trying to silence people who are pro-Palestinian, here in Canada is almost as bad as it is in the United States, where they are really, really, really militant on that.
The role of my country, or the role
to the point where people are being disappeared on the streets.
Of the West in these atrocities. It was to look at it critically. It wasn't to look at it...
By your country, you mean Canada?
That's right. It wasn't to look at it with some distance of this is something alien that's happening over there, which is natural and normalized. It was to critically look at our role, and by the our again, you know, Canadians, people in the West, in the Anglosphere. So I wrote a dissertation that looked at the International Law of Self-Determination and where international institutions, you know, for example, the UN, the International Court of Justice, the most powerful members of these institutions, when they fail to secure rights, what happens? Like, is that the end? And I looked at South Africa during apartheid and compared that to Palestine. Because in my mind, these are two places where...
Again, something that scholars and sociologists and many other people in academia do today and in the past and like 20 years ago, 30 years ago have done in comparison, comparing both what's happening in Palestine, the apartheid state in Israel, to what's happening or what happened, in South Africa.
Institutions were paralyzed. So they would say, yes, this group of people has the right to self-determination. They have human rights. There really isn't much we can do about it because we're not prepared to do any more than to pay lip service about it. So these institutions would freeze. And I thought, well, okay, so how did this play out in South Africa? Like, where institutions drop the ball, is there any hope for civil society, for individuals who often don't see themselves as actors in history? They see themselves as observers of history. But is there something that, for those of us concerned about human rights, what can we do?
I'm just going to speed this up a little just because it is very long. Not to, you know, be disrespectful to him or whatever, but just for time's sake.
South Africa provide a helpful illustration of we can pick up the ball where these institutions drop it. And so I coined a term in that dissertation, which was eventually published, called, excuse me, populist legal movements.
Populist legal movements.
Correct, PLMs. And this is before populism started to be associated with Trump or Orban or some of these nefarious...
With a sort of nefarious nationalism.
You got it. Yeah. And so it was more...
I mean, populism has been, you know, associated with people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the past too, but I do get what he's talking about there.
The way that I defined it was a sense of something that was stripped of elites, of institutions, of the powerful, and where its people take it back. And it was really interesting how this worked in South Africa. So, for example, the boycott movement in South Africa was having conferences in London in the late 60s. And some of the leaders of that in England would be people like Rosalind Higgins, who would one day become a judge on the International Court of Justice. It's very active in presenting a legal argument for the boycott movement. And so that's the L part of that, you know, PLM.
Part,
right.
Yeah.
Where can we harness a legal language? Because for all the things that people might talk about in terms of what the law is, it is also a form of discourse. It's a form of argument, stripped away from the institutions that enforce it and things like that. So I was concerned about, okay, what does this mean for Palestine? and other areas where institutions have failed to secure the rights of people that they say that they have, but aren't really prepared to do much more about it. And then again, enrolling as a PhD student, I went further, and my work explored international humanitarian law, and it looked at state violence. And it used as a vehicle this concept of terrorism, right, which isn't defined in international law. It's defined in domestic law in various places. So international law was more concerned with suppressing certain actions. So for example, hijacking airplanes.
Yes.
For the most part, it doesn't provide you with an international legal definition of what it is. So I looked at that and...
Well, was it Reagan who said one person's terrorism is another person's freedom fighter?
Yeah, and I'm sure others have also said it. And of course, the term first, sort of enters consciousness during the French Revolution.
Well, you're giving me a very academic viewpoint of all this. I'm hearing a lot of academics speak. I really want to know, though, because for a lot of people, we see these similarities between South Africa and Palestine. We see the sterile roads. We know there's a two-tier system. Palestinians are under military rule. They're not in the civil, legal system. We know there's different colored license plates. All the markers are there.
Yeah.
But for so many people, it's not black and white. And I use that pun on purpose, right? And when you mix in the history of how Israel was constructed on the ashes of the Holocaust and all this stuff, it gets really complicated and complex for a lot of people. So I want to leave all of that. I want to leave all of that. I understand where your commitment to human rights comes from, how it sort of set you on this trajectory academically. You go on to be Assistant Regional Director of the Alberta Human Rights Commission, Executive Director of the Yukon Human Rights Commission. These are big positions. Not rinky-dinky here. Okay. What are your thoughts when you first heard that you're being considered for Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission?
When I heard I was first being considered, and I was invited to apply, I thought, okay, there's no way. And wasn't interested. Like I saw that the position, like I knew the incumbent who was set to retire at a certain point in time, who was eventually, and I thought to myself, no, there's no way. And then
why did you think this isn't, there's no way?
I think that's just probably a little bit of, but probably two things, right? So one is the idea of everybody has a little bit of imposter syndrome, right? And that probably factored into it.
Valid.
But something else also factors into it, which is when you come from a background like mine, part of you, and you don't want to believe it to be true, but, and this comes out later when I was described as the first, POC, the first person of color, the first Muslim. And I'm aware of that in terms of knowing who had led these organizations in the past, not just that one, but other public bodies. And you, as much as you try and dismiss it, you think, no, they're not interested in, bringing on board someone from this background. And with a name that's hard to pronounce and maybe a bit younger than people that have historically held these positions, like 65-year-old straight white men, right? There seems to be a factory that produces these people to assume leadership positions and nothing else. So the idea that I was being considered, was, okay, well, this is, subjectively, this is surprising.
And it's a very rigorous, process from what I hear, 2 years.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. And so you get let's get to the position. You get the position.
Yeah.
The government makes this big announcement, press release, June 14th, 2024. I want to read out how they describe you. He brings a wealth of both professional and personal lived experience to this role. Our government remains committed to the protection of all human rights in Canada, including the fight against racism and to strengthening our country's role within the international human rights system. Signed, RF Varani. What are you feeling at this point as this release comes out? You've gotten this position. That you must have been on cloud nine.
No, actually. No. I think, and it's interesting, I remember that weekend, and it coincided, that weekend happened to be my birthday. So I had a friend who had come to Toronto.
Gemini.
There you go. Yeah, the whole duality thing. But, so I've heard, and this friend was wondering
why are you not excited about this? And this had occurred to me 2 or 3 days later. So that thing I described in Alberta, which would have occurred to me instantly, and I knew that I was going to assume the role before that public announcement, right? Of course, they had told me a couple of weeks before. And so, there was some excitement, for the first few days. I put it out of my head after that. It's just a thing that's going to happen now with a public announcement. And again, just living the last 17.
Which again, like, good for him, because like he's so right about the fact that like even here in Canada, like in other countries, other Western countries, the likelihood of somebody like himself, a young person of color who's Muslim, on top of that, being appointed one of those roles in government, especially the federal government, is like very slim, very slim.
Months.
So again, good for him. Like honestly, he earned it clearly. But then again, everything happened, and just to put it in a more lighter tone, the Fire Nation attacked, and here we are now.
We know how much polarization and vitriol, especially around identities and things like that. And so at some point during this weekend, after the public announcement, this friend of mine says, you seem distant, like you're not here. What's going on? And, so my father sent me a happy birthday message, but then he also expressed how proud he was. And a few family members did the same thing. They thought of it as a big deal. And I was asked, is this more like a childhood trauma? Like, did your parents not tell you they loved you enough? And again, coming from a South Asian background,
oh my God.
You got 98, why didn't you get 100?
Right, exactly.
Why am I not excited?
Right, like,
oh my God. It must be childhood trauma. Oh my God.
all that. So, is this a childhood trauma thing? And I said, no, it's not that. I can't quite put my finger on it. And I didn't want to speak it out loud. But I thought, okay, my identity, and I thought more, okay, there's just going to be crazy people on Twitter.
Right.
Because like this was tweeted. So I thought, okay, Twitter trolls. I wasn't necessarily thinking anything more organized than that, but I'm thinking I'm going to read a lot of unpleasantness. And this has happened everywhere. Like when I was appointed executive director of the Yukon Human Rights Commission, my predecessor said, we're going to do a press release. And I'm like, okay, do we have to, right? Yeah. Because the first thing that happens, and of course I end up reading the comments section, and they were shocked. They're like, don't read the comments section. This is really gross. And I'm like, well, I'm used to it. Like people are going to go, what kind of name is that? Oh, is he Muslim? Oh, we need to deport that. Right? Like it floods the comment section. And again, you haven't done anything, right? Like all they've done is they've announced you're taking the role, similar to that message, has experience, great. Unfortunately, it's the sort of world that we live in. So that's kind of what I was nervous about. I figured it's going to be like that Yukon experience. And I
it was almost an anticipatory anxiety there,
right, but now on a bigger scale, right? And it was more Twitter trolls and
and again, for those who like to pretend that racism doesn't exist in Canada, it does. It is here, and it is alive and well, unfortunately. Because you can't live in a colonial post in pre and current genocidal country without racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia existing.
I don't like the limelight. I don't like attention. I didn't get much of it. And even with this role, I mean, speaking to a law professor who specialized in human rights law, he said, I've been studying this for 20 years. I can't name a previous chief commissioner, right? Like it's not, I mean, on the one hand, like the media will call it, this important position, this prestigious position. It doesn't get a lot of press, right, in that sense. And so...
Well, I can tell you that I've spoken to people about you. No one had ever heard your name.
Yeah.
They didn't know. So it's June 14th, and then on the 24th, the attacks start. And I went back and looked.
Yeah.
It seemed quite coordinated in the frequency, the vitriol.
Yeah.
What's going through your mind as you start reading these?
So, and I knew a little bit earlier because, of course, the National Post had emailed me on June the 19th. So I think at that point, I'm like, okay, it begins, right? Here we go. So any notion that this would have been, a pain-free process to August 8th, I now know that that's not going to be the case. But I thought of some of the questions. I thought, okay, this is just silly. It's the National Post. Who cares, right? I mean, if I was the sort of person that the National Post...
The National Post is, for those who don't know, in Canada, a more right-wing opinion piece newspaper type of deal. Think like Fox News if it was more reading, which I know a lot of people who consume Fox News don't really do much of.
Spoke highly of or thought highly of, I'd have a problem with myself, right? I mean, so I really didn't care. The National Post is not a place you go to, to actually be informed of anything. But I think, yeah, when that started, I think really, and what I was being told was, okay, this will happen now, not a big deal, right? 2 weeks, right? This happens to people that occupy public office, right? And there's a certain group of people, that are political junkies to whom this appeals, right? So if the ethics commissioner does something or says something, in a town like Ottawa, yeah, there will be a group of people interested in it, right? But the rest of the world doesn't care. And it's just like, okay, write this up.
I'm people, unfortunately. Oh, sorry, something happened on my TV.
For 2 weeks, welcome to the national stage, whatever, right? And again, it's a National Post.
I just want to read one of these posts. This is from a person that you are suing for defamation. This is Melissa Landsman, co-deputy leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, official opposition. And she posted this on X. Another anti-Semite gets promoted by Trudeau. Birju Detani, known for perpetuating hate toward Jews, has been appointed chief of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. This is an elected official accusing you of being an anti-Semite, a proponent of terrorism. What's going through your mind?
Well, I think at that time, I didn't read, that post you read, Melissa Landsman, if I'm being frank. Yeah.
How did you come to know that this was happening online? Apart from just the National Post, getting in touch with you.
So by this point, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, other media outlets were reaching out to me. So I had some sense of where they were going. I think the thing I wasn't seeing, or wasn't looking at were what the politicians were saying, whether it was Melissa Landsman or Marco Mendicino or David Lametti. At that moment, I'm putting myself in a media blackout. Because
I mean,
you start
rightfully
reading these
so.
things.
I can only imagine. I mean, I get microscopic amounts of it as a woman online, but I can only imagine it's probably way worse as a Muslim man online with a Muslim sounding name and being somebody who is at a higher degree in Canada job wise and being accused of being anti Semitic and anti Israel and having to deal with that backlash. I don't blame him for doing a little bit of a media break, media blackout at that point.
And they're upsetting. And that makes it harder to stay calm at a time when you may need it, right? So now I'm under a microscope. I need to be calm in a crisis. And so the best thing at the time was not to be looking at this stuff and then getting in your head about it. A lot of these things I didn't see till August, right? That's where I start very gingerly combing through some of these, right? And there's a certain morbid curiosity about it where I'm like, okay, let's actually see what gems of wisdom they had to offer. And so that's where I started coming across these things for the first time.
It's not just Landsman, right? You're going up against some really big organizations in this country, the Center for Israeli Jewish Affairs, CJA, B'nai B'rith, one of the oldest Jewish organizations that purports to speak on behalf of all Jews. You're going up against some organizations that really have the ear of lawmakers in this country, and a lot of our lawmakers get paid by these organizations.
Yeah.
And then you have these self-diagnosed Toronto-based media influencer Dalia Kurtz, Ezra Levant, who runs Rebel News. And you're laughing, but they
and the Rebel News one just absolutely horrid. Like if for anybody who doesn't know about Rebel News, the blonde white supremacist, proud, xenophobic nationalist from Sam Cedars' episode on Jubilee is an alumni of Rebel News. So just a little taste of what Rebel News is like. Not only that, but Rebel News also has a bad reputation of chasing politicians in our country, harassing them, and just being public menaces in the name of owning the libs. Like I consider calling them news to be a disservice to the organization of news media.
They do have some influence,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Sure.
And the government did react to these allegations, right? They launched this third-party led fact-finding mission,
Right.
which ultimately concluded, and this is the point that I really want to come to, that it could find no evidence of anti-Semitism or demonstrated bias against Jews or Israelis.
Yeah.
So does that make the accusation stop?
No, it doesn't. I mean, because the reason it doesn't, and I've thought about this often, there's a difference between, let's take an anodyne fact, right? So let's pick today's date, which is, and I never know what day it is, but what's the date today? It's
March 26th.
yeah, Wednesday, right? Wednesday, March 26th. So if I had said, Samira, Wednesday, March 25th, and you told me, look, Richard, it's actually the 26th. You mean the 26th? I would say, yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. I don't need it to be the 25th today. I don't need that to be true. If I responded and I said, well, look, Samira, I mean, in Japan, like it might, there's a different calendar and they actually, so I'm not really wrong. I was actually right when I said the 25th. If I need it to be true, and this is sort of like an interesting thing, when people need things to be true, independent from whether or not they are true, this is where, I mean, it is probably a start to a definition of what an ideologue is, right? So I need something to be true. I need, for example, in a more geopolitical sense, most moral army, right? So if I said most moral army, which country are you thinking of? Where have you heard that before?
Israel.
Okay, there are people that need that to be true. So whether it is true, so if we're providing facts that maybe undermine that, most people that don't have an ideological commitment to this will look at that the way that they look at most facts, right? True. But the point being that if you're ideologically committed to a position, then again, you can't accept facts, right? So there, it doesn't matter what Human Rights Watch says or what Amnesty.
And that's exactly where news media sources like Rebel News fall, and that's exactly where papers and legacy media like the National Post fall here in Canada, where they have a political agenda and it doesn't matter what reality or truth is. Once they've decided something, that is the end all be all. That is where they're going to go with their analysis, and to them that is as close to reality as anything else can be.
The International says, or what the International Court of Justice says, or what the International Criminal Court says, or what Oxfam says, or what the World Food Program says. Because you have a measuring stick by which you're measuring something, and if the thing doesn't measure up, ideologues will throw out the measuring stick, right?
And that's the crux of your case, right? The crux of your case is that the third-party investigation was done. There were not even an inkling of anti-Semitism or bias against Jews, against Israelis, etc. found, yet these accusations persisted.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
And so that is really the crux of your case.
Right.
But if we move beyond your case,
yep,
we're living in a time where anyone speaking out on Israel's genocide is being reprimanded, risking their livelihoods, education, grants.
Yep, this is something that, again, I showed previously in the beginning of talking about this whole scenario with the former new Human Rights Commissioner and his launching of lawsuits against the owner of Rebel News and a Conservative MP,
etc. You name it. We've all seen people being stripped of it.
Yep.
What are your thoughts? I mean, you're first and foremost a human rights lawyer. I know that you've become the center of this case, but when you look at this level of persecution and in some cases prosecution, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, and I'll probably offer two. The first is, at least for me, I found this dislocating, right? Where I'm watching this unfold, and Mark Haven had an interesting article about how, which was titled, "Who Can Be Anti-Semitic?" Well, anybody, but mostly the racialized. And this has had, and as you know, racialized journalists, healthcare workers, educators, lawyers. You can run the list of every profession, any any type of employment, any type of
Cooks even, I know
cooks, yeah, service relationship, you know, you name it. And it's immensely dislocating because it sort of demonstrates that people that have a skin tone like mine, or like maybe like yours, our lives don't matter. You know, they don't, right? I mean, in the scheme of things, there's a certain amount of privilege that a system will let you have, right? And I was reminded of reading a case during the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, so 100 years ago. And in Vancouver, there is someone, Southeast Asian fellow, Chinese fellow, who is attacked by, you know, this group of people. They're all white, and he fights back, self-defense. One of them happens to be a police officer, right? Wasn't on duty at the time. And so a lot of commentary on that was he was guilty of being a Chinese person that assaulted a white person, right? So he violated this rule of knowing your place, and his place in that society was non-existence, right? As Omar Al-Akkad might put it, right? So he violated that rule of non-existence. You know, during this assault,
again, like he said, that happened here in Canada. So again, to those who like to pretend that in Canada we don't have racism, it's here. It's been here forever. It's here. It's unfortunate, but that is the reality of our country and our history. And, you know, pretending that it doesn't exist doesn't make it go away.
they kind of knew who he was, right? So a lot of these people who are racialized, right, they're violating that rule here as well.
Do you
right?
put yourself in that line? Do you put yourself in that through line of historically the people who didn't know their place and are now?
Yeah. Well, that's a thought I have, right? Is that I'm not allowed to speak this way, right?
If not you, who though? See,
Right.
that's the thing when I was looking at your case. Master's SOAS, PhD, you know, Alberta Regional Director, Yukon Human Rights Commission. If it's not you, then
Honestly, shocked he even made it through the Alberta one, honestly, considering Alberta's reputation.
and who can speak? You know, that is very dangerous. Right?
Yeah.
It's very dangerous to think that it doesn't matter how many degrees or how learned we are. We're not allowed to say the thing is the thing.
Well, and there's a certain distance here that
True. It doesn't matter. Like, if you, even here in Canada, if you step out of line and you are a person of color, you will be knocked down a peg. You will be punished for speaking out and speaking, you know, to truth and pushing back against the powers that be. It's fucking horrible.
that the system puts between most people and someone like me, you know, Muslim identity, brown guy, a name that you're going to butcher over and over again until I tell you, you know, how it's pronounced phonetically. This didn't really have much to do with anything that I did. And one of the things I reflected on is, you know, I kept thinking what was frustrating is I'm thinking, you know, they'll say he shared a panel with this guy, he shared a panel with Ben White. Here's what Ben White thinks. I'm like, cool, Ben White thinks that. What do I think? Like, what are you objecting to that I've said? Or he shared a panel with Moazzam Beg, who was in Guantanamo Bay, right? He was a Guantanamo Bay detainee, was tortured in Guantanamo Bay. I'm like, cool, not a fan of torture, but how come you're like omitting that the guy sitting next to me was from Breitbart News? And why don't you think that I could hold his views instead of the other Muslim guy on the panel? Oh, it's because we're both brown, right? So it's more, what in your imagination is this guy, right, who's Muslim, who's brown, whose name you can't pronounce? What is he actually capable of? Forget what he did, right? It's enough to think that, you know, writing something in a dissertation about terrorism, right? You know, the Globe and Mail headline, new human rights chief once made academic argument. I'm thinking, okay, whatever follows is going to be absolutely hilarious now, right? That terrorism can be a rational strategy. At that point, there was almost 12 academics in this country who I'd never met who called out the Globe and Mail saying, this isn't controversial in this area. Maybe try talking to an expert rather than asking, you know, groups like CJ or Friends of Simon Wiesenthal their view on something that ostensibly they don't have any expertise in, right? But the idea
up,
that
though.
was being
Seriously.
manufactured in the media is, but wait, what is he capable of? It doesn't matter what he did, right? So go back to 2006 for a minute, and because this isn't small potatoes, right? Let's look at Maher.
It's just like what I said prior when I was talking about Sarah Jama. These are things that sociologists, that historians, that academics of many, 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 many different fields have talked about, have, you know, alluded to. And it's the same like the thing that I said the other day when I was talking about the Jessica situation on TikTok with the NDP party and them denouncing her, because she also correctly compared what's happening in Gaza to the Holocaust, to it being an apartheid state and stuff. And the fact that these institutions and political parties and, you know, governments as a whole are just willing to throw people under the bus if it means appeasing and comforting Schmianus, again doing that for TOS, in Canada.
Right?
Yes.
2006, right? The O'Connor Report is published, right? 3 volumes on Ontario Court of Appeal justice. He was scathing.
Or not hurting the feelings of the Israeli government and the IDF.
Let's look at Mahurar, right?
Yes.
2006, right? The O'Connor Report is published, right? 3 volumes on Ontario Court of Appeal justice. He was scathing about the media's complicity in having this guy detained for 2 years. When the commissioner tortured, yes, thank you. When the commissioner of the RCMP, who admitted that within days he knew that the guy was innocent, right?
Really?
And some of these, you know, journalists who are still journalists in prominent positions, who had a role to play and who were called out. You know, if that were me, I'd be embarrassed to show my face. And these people are celebrated.
Well, they just say they're doing their job.
Right, yeah. And
right, my editor told me, I made a phone call,
right.
This is what was happening, you know,
right.
That's sort of...
Just following orders, yeah.
I want to stick to the media. You brought up the media.
Right.
I went back and I was looking at all the media clippings about your resignation and then the entire story, the accusations. And the only thing that was missing from the media was the part where the investigation found no wrongdoing on your part.
That's right.
What impact do you think the media had on promulgating these accusations against you?
In my view, they had the most central role. They had the most central role. And in some ways, you know,
even the CTV clip that I showed prior to his announcement, there was also very little pushback towards, you know, what people were saying about him in regards to what he even said in the first place. Like, they were firmly on the side of, he's bad, we got to tell everybody he's bad, and that's it.
No, I never really had high expectations of, you know, the legacy media in this country. I would tell my father, right? He's part of a generation where the news is always on, right? Like, you know, and I said, look, if you're watching CTV, CBC, Global, because you're expecting them to tell you what's happening in the world, or you want them to feed you the analysis of something, can I swear?
Yes, of course, nobody funds us.
All right, great. So if you're fucked, right? Don't bother, right? That was always my view. I didn't have a ton of respect, right, for the legacy media, but this was just, you're going out of your way. This was like this is the unmaking of language. This is the unmaking of narrative, right? The media would have known, right, or ought to have, right? Like, what's the expression? If you're a journalist and someone tells you it's raining and someone else doesn't, your job isn't to say, hey, this person says it's raining, this person doesn't.
And leave it there.
Right, like, look out the fucking window, right? Like, do some confirmation, right? Like, the media was going, in my view, out of their way, right? Or that terrorism angle, where at least 2 academics, one in journalism, one in security studies, said, hey, Globe and Mail, this is a bad faith smear job. This looks like a hit job. Next time, talk to someone who's an expert in security studies or terrorism or anything else. Like, you're going out of your way.
I'm shocked that he's not going after more people, to be honest, and more organizations, to be honest. And as much as I do love the CBC, because I think it's a, you know, great resource for poor people and people of color in Canada to be able to get news, and people who live in rural areas to get news, it's honestly, you know, shameful that they would do that and also perpetuate the lies that are smearing this man's fucking reputation.
To manufacture a narrative that I suspect you know is not true, because you're bumping up against facts that, if you're doing your job, you ought to present.
9 months has passed. You finally decided, you know what, I'm going to go after these people who tarnished my image.
Yeah.
What finally made you want to do that?
couple of things. First of all, I've been watching like everybody else what's been happening for 17 or 18 months. I haven't publicly said anything on Gaza. And watching that unfold, like a lot of people, I had trouble sleeping every night. I don't think I slept more than 6 hours. And you're walking this tightrope. You're being careful about what you say. And when you come from certain backgrounds, even to express compassion, about the images of children. I have a 6-year-old nephew who I was something,
Well, and we saw, just like in the other clips that I showed, it's like Sarah Jama and the Queen's Park like house. When it comes to, people speaking against this type of stuff, even in any kind of sympathetic or empathetic way, people will treat you like you are pro terrorism, that you're pro Hamas, that you are pro October 7th, which isn't true. Like, or that you don't care about the hostages, even though the Israeli government themselves don't even really care about the hostages and are just using them as propaganda mills, while, bombing indiscriminately above them every fucking day, and, murdering people who are just trying to survive in what semblance of, home they have left. It's absolutely just like impossible to fight against that, to fight back against the propaganda and the silencing, and people just trying to, continue the lies of the apartheid state. Like, it's such an uphill battle, and it's so incredibly hard, and just everywhere people are pushing back against pro-Palestinian voices.
The day was
I'm gonna go blow my nose again.
born. I was something of like a surrogate parent, and my sister and I are very close. I've fed him, I've changed his diapers, I've bathed him, I put him to sleep. And those kids look like him. Shouldn't be surprised that brown people have sympathy when other brown people are dying. We also have sympathy when white people die. I mean, this isn't, it's again, that thing that I said about distance a moment ago. We don't really have that distance. I was mortified about the plight of Israeli hostages. I was, grossed out, and beyond words when Mila Cohen, the 10-month-old baby, was killed on October 7th. The Bibas family was heart-wrenching. And we know the names of Israeli hostages. I mean, I can state that back to you. I don't know if some of the people that are making the accusations against me would be able to share you the names of, someone who is an administrative detainee, in Israel, or someone who was, sexually assaulted or raped in Sidi Taman prison under the most horrific circumstances.
Or the names of any of the 15,000 children killed.
Right. Yeah. Just one. Right. But, I didn't talk about that stuff. And in the meantime, I'm seeing, this person is fired. This person is driven out of their jobs. What I was really seeing is accusation is made against a person. That is then investigated. It is then found that that person didn't violate a policy, a harassment or discrimination policy. That person isn't an anti-Semite within, any sort of, a definition of that. And nevertheless, I mean, this happens so frequently that I'm tired of this.
Seems like the accusation is enough, though.
No, and the accusation, and that's just it.
Because I was speaking with your lawyer prior to, and she was speaking to me about the weaponization of anti-Semitism that we've seen over the past 17 months, right? UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, anti-Semitic, Oxfam.
Oh, let me give you two more if I can quickly. So take, and this is recent, but it's coming back like a bad penny. Derek Penzler, right? The William Lee Frost Professor in Jewish Studies at Harvard University, the director of the Center of Jewish Studies at Harvard University, a guy who's from Toronto, right? Formerly at the University of Toronto, brilliant scholar, by the way, who was named the co-chair of Harvard's Task Force on Anti-Semitism after Claudine Gay resigned.
Yes.
He was called 2 days ago, yet again, an anti-Semite. In fact, in the month of March, he's been called an anti-Semite for two different things. One of them was hosting a panel on Lebanon, right, of Israel's war in Lebanon. Another was, the most recent one was he advertised a course called 1,000 Years of Palestine on the Center for Jewish Studies' website, of which he is the director. The American Academy of Jewish Research has said no one has done more to combat anti-Semitism and to, as a scholar of Zionism, as a scholar of Jewish studies, he is unrivaled.
But do you find solace in that?
I do like that he did bring up the fact that, there's the same type of pushback against pro-Palestinian voices, including people who are of Jewish descent and who are experts in like Jewish studies and stuff, and places like Harvard are also being smeared and called anti-Semite. I can't talk today. And are also receiving the same kind of pushback because it's true. It's happening here. It's happening in America. It's happening in England. It's happening all over the West, and it's honestly just baffling to see, especially since the genocide is being advertised out there for everybody to see. It is on our phones. It is on our TVs. It is everywhere.
Do you think to yourself, you know what, I'm in good company? And just to know that sort of, I was getting to this, that, the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, has also been called anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Oxfam is now anti-Semitic.
Doctors Without Borders.
Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, yours truly.
Yeah.
Does this list of people and organizations provide you with any solace? Or any comfort?
Well, I mean, I think the way I look at it, like what concerns me is that this is going to, my fear is that it undermines the fight against anti-Semitism. Like, I actually feel more fearful than I think I feel solace. Is anti-Semitism is a problem, right? And I don't think it's reasonable for, I don't think you're...
I mean, I should have assumed that he would talk about it since he is, somebody who has worked within human rights and is a human rights lawyer, that he would talk about the impact this will have on, raising anti-Semitism in Canada and around the world. And, examples of it are true. It has, conflating Judaism with what is going on in, in Israel, and, comparing the two together rather than being like, there's the Israeli government and then there are Jewish people, like turning them into one and the same as a way to counteract pro-Palestinian opinions and stuff. Like that leads to more anti-Semitism. And experts, he's said it, other people have said it, and it is troubling. It's scary. It's honestly scary.
You're going to find reasonable people that are going to disagree. I'm worried about what this means, in the end for Jewish people, right?
About the hollowing out of the term, you mean?
Yeah, look, we need to reflexively defend Israel at any and all costs. Like, we need to do this thing where we're conflating the two things, and it doesn't matter. They're not thinking 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, right? And that worries me.
Last question.
Yeah.
Again, I want to go beyond your case, because you've mentioned
please.
this before and said that you're doing this not just for yourself, but for other people.
Yeah.
What is it that is really moving you to do this beyond yourself? What are you hoping will come out of this?
I know. Firstly, and I think we both do, but so many people, this has happened to so many people whose stories will never be in the public eye, right? Who are going to have to suffer in silence and be tarred with this, who don't have the resources, to take this to court. Also, there needs to be a cost imposed on these sorts of strategies, right? There does, right? Like, this is happening so often, so frequently, in such bad faith that it's targeting too many people, right? This is happening too often. Where, okay, yeah, like, this needs to stop, right? Like, it's not just I'm exhausted of this, but I'm exhausted that this is happening to too many people. This isn't a serious conversation anymore. I'm angry about this, and I don't. My story is a sliver in this wider narrative, right? And so this needs to stop. It really does. And so if this is the way, if other people get behind, whether they get behind me or they get behind anybody, if people say, you know what, okay, you can't get away with this. Like, you really can't. Impunity does have limits at the end of the day.
Well, I hope the next time we speak and I follow up on this, you will be victorious.
That might be years from now, but hopefully we can talk before then.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Can you?
I'm really glad that, he's at least been able to like talk about it. This, by the way, came out 6 days ago. Um, just absolutely horrid that the war on, pro-Palestinian voices is still raging, is still, you know, just tearing people apart, ruining lives and stuff like that. And it's something that like you always want to expect better of your home country when it comes to this type of stuff, even though, like I said and shown before, there are many examples of the opposite obviously being true. But it's so disappointing. Like, I don't even, and I'm somebody who pays attention to the news, by the way. Like, obviously I'm, talking about it currently, but this is something that like I didn't even hear about. And as you can see from my jean jacket, I'm a pro-Palestinian voice. So it's just so crazy. It's just so crazy that a Muslim man who was not only, the head of or was not only a human rights lawyer, but was somebody who worked in human rights in Alberta, and somebody who worked in human rights in the Yukon, and, wrote like dissertations on what happened in Israel Palestine, and is very educated on this. And it isn't like he made a tweet or something. Like, it is something that like he studied and he talked about. Like, the fact that even he's not safe from, the hands of the Shmayanist, again for TOS, the Shmayanist uh smear campaigns and silencing campaigns is just, it's troubling. It's like, if he can't talk about it, then who can, right? If MPs and MPPs can't talk about it, who can, right? And it makes me insanely proud of all of the young people that I see out there who are protesting in Canada every Saturday going out and protest. And I I just want to like leave this part with just saying, like, if you are pro-Palestinian, just keep up the good fight, and keep telling people in your proximity, what is going on. Keep trying to educate people. Do everything in your power that you can to educate people, and never give up hope that, one day we may be able to, see peace finally in Palestine. It's just so sad.